Hello. Today is Thursday, 17th of May, and so I'm going to do the presentation on the deportation of the Crimean Tatars today, the day before the 74th anniversary. And tomorrow, 18th of May, will be the 74th anniversary of this particular crime against humanity by the Stalinist regime. So I'm doing mainly because tomorrow is a Friday, so the weekend begins. So I'll have it out here one day earlier. Now, the Crimean Tatars are the indigenous people of the Crimean Peninsula. That means that they evolved as a distinct ethnic group on the territory and soil of Crimea, where they lived in a significant number until they were forcibly removed. Now, they become a minority due to being forced out by the Tsarist government in large numbers and Russian settlement after the Crimean War in 1854 to 1856. Crimea itself had come under rule of the Russian Empire in 1783 after being annexed by Catherine II, and it was that time opened up for settlement for people not only in the Russian Empire but outside. A number of ethnic Germans, I discussed in my series on the Russian Germans, also settled in Crimea, and they had been deported by the Stalin regime first to the North Caucasus and then into Kazakhstan in 1941. So the Crimean Tatars, the indigenous people of Crimea, had a fairly developed, for early modern European standards, state of their own in the Crimean Khanate, allied with the Ottoman Empire, comes under Russian rule in 1783. Tsarist repression leads to the expulsion of a large number of Crimean Tatars in the late 19th century after the Crimean War, making them a minority within their homeland, but they are still a significant minority, and this lasts all the way up until the end of World War II. Now, when the Tsarist government collapses, there are attempts to fail to create an independent Crimean Tatar state under Mili Furka in 1918. There is created a Crimean Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, which, despite the fact that it says Crimean and not Crimean Tatar, you look at other legislation, particularly regarding the use of the Crimean Tatar language, it was, in fact, a Crimean Tatar national autonomous territory. And one of the things that happens is that the leaders in this national autonomous territory, Crimean Tatar communists like Veli Ibrahimov, try and push for real national autonomy. Veli Ibrahimov is executed early on by the Stalin regime, and there is considerable disillusionment by many of the Crimean Tatar masses with Soviet rule as a result of repression, 32-33 famine, and the 1937-1938 Great Terror. So that when World War II comes about, while there are a large number, over 20,000 Crimean Tatar men, so over 10% of the total population, fighting in the Soviet Red Army against the Nazis. Due to Soviet incompetence, the Soviet military in Crimea eventually collapses, and the territory becomes occupied by the Germans. And the partisan units established by the NKVD behind German lines are run by incompetent and drunks who are heavily racist against the Crimean Tatars and spend most of their time attacking Crimean Tatar villages rather than actually resisting the Germans. And this means that a number of the Crimean Tatars, mostly who had been in the Soviet Red Army, either captured as prisoners of war or in some cases had just dissolved out and then later decided to join uh, forces with the Germans, were organized into self-defense units to defend the Crimean Tatar villages. Now, the number of people in these Crimean Tatar self-defense forces organized by the Germans is disputed. The Soviet government, without any real evidence, basically just Beria claiming that it was the fact, we didn't need any evidence because he was head of the NKVD, that there were 20,000 Crimean Tatars defected from the Red Army. Many of them were actually taken prisoner, and the Red Army in Crimea disintegrated. There wasn't anything to defect from, really, structurally. And joined with the Germans to fight, all of them fight against the Soviets. Now, this number is way too high, but even if it was accurate, it's still not a majority of the Crimean Tatar population, obviously. Still only 10% of the total population, which was punished severely by the Soviet government starting on 18th of May 1944. But the figures we get from other sources, it looks like I've seen figures of 10,000 Crimean Tatars in German self-defense forces. I've seen figures even lower, somewhere around 5,000. And in absolute numbers, of course, this is no threat to the Soviet government because there were quite literally millions of Russians that collaborated with the German military occupation. And there was no wholesale punishment of the Russian people. And the same thing with Ukrainians, as Khrushchev noted, the reason Stalin didn't deport all the Ukrainians is that there were simply too many of them and no place to put them. Crimean Tatar nation was quite small, in large part because in the late 19th century, the Tsarist Russian government, as part of a colonial process of removing the indigenous population and replacing it with European settlers, had already forced out hundreds of thousands of Crimean Tatars. So they had become a minority within their own country. Some only about 20% of the total population. So the Crimean Tatars, because of their history of independence, both as fully independent state under the Crimean Khanate and within the Soviet Union, attempts by Crimean Tatar communists to make the Crimean Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic genuinely autonomous within the Soviet structure, as taking the Soviet Union at its word that it actually supported a national autonomy, was considered a problematic nationality by the Soviet government. One of the indigenous nationalities, as opposed to the diaspora nationalities like the German, which I've talked about a lot here on this channel. And World War II is a opportunity for the Soviet government to have a final solution, as it were, to all of the national problems within its borders, particularly those dealing with small nationalities that had long been a problem for the Soviet government and further back, Tsarist government. In some cases, also just pure racial punishment for things that had happened in the past. For instance, the Crimean Tatars had been engaged in slave raids against the Russian Empire when the Crimean Khanate was an independent state. They sacked Moscow twice. They were a state allied with the Ottoman Empire that had been opposed to the expansion of the Russian Empire. Now, obviously, the Crimean Khanate and the Crimean Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic are very, very different states politically. But they share in the fact that their ethnic core, the leadership, are the same people in terms of culture, in terms of ethnicity. That is, they are people that are descendants of the same ethnogenesis, right? And so the cultural core of Crimean Tatars is a language. It is a distinct language but is related to other Turkic languages, but it is not the same as Volga Tatar. Uh, we look at the connection to the land, obviously, strong connection by Crimean Tatars to the land of Crimean Peninsula, because it's the only homeland they've ever known. We look at religion, like most Muslims in the Ottoman Empire, associated with the Ottoman Empire, in case of the Crimean Khanate, as well as other parts of the Soviet Union, with the exception of Azerbaijan, Sunni Muslims of the Hanafi school. Right, so the Ottomans were the largest and strongest empire supporting this particular school of Islam, Hanafi Sunniism, and it is the one that in the Caucasus and Crimea and even Central Asia is the dominant form of Islam. All right, so in the Soviet Union, the only a large group of people that are Muslims that are not Sunni are Azeris, who because of Iranian influence are Shiite. So the Crimean Tatars, official reason for their mass punishment by the Stalin regime in 1944 is that they in mass betrayed the Soviet Union, went over to fight for the Nazis against the Soviet Red Army, and killed innocent Soviet citizens. Now, in reality, the level of collaboration in absolute number is very small. In percentage, ranging between 5%, some of the numbers I've seen, to the ridiculously high, probably now that I, after having looked at this for years, claimed by the Soviets of 20%. And this is 20% not of the adult male population, but of the total population. So it's a little bit higher in this, if you subtract women and children, but it's still a minority of the total population, since women and children were also punished. And as I said, almost every Soviet nationality, there's a fairly high level of collaboration for those that came under actual Soviet rule, or had a significant large number of prisoners of war that could be recruited out of POW camps. So, in this sense, the Crimean Tatar self-defense forces aren't any different on a basic level than many other military units formed out of Russian and Ukrainian and Belarusian and Georgian, there's a Georgian Legion, Armenians and the Armenian Legion, by the German military to engage in various auxiliary military support for the German war effort on the Eastern Front. But it is the excuse used by the Soviet government to taint and to slander the entire Crimean Tatar nation with the claim that they were all collaborators with Nazi Germany and had betrayed the Soviet Union. Right? Obviously, anybody rationally think, well, the entire population, all the children, the invalids, people can't walk. The people were actually fighting at that time in the Soviet Red Army, and there were quite a few of them, against Nazi Germany, including, in fact, the one Soviet citizen that is awarded the hero of the Soviet Union, not once but twice, was a Crimean Tatar. He was a fighter pilot. Right? Now, he's given exemption from being forcibly sent to Uzbekistan himself, but his family is deported. It's almost the entire population. There are very few exceptions of people that are not forcibly rounded up and sent eastward by the Stalin regime. So I'm almost to the 15-minute mark here. So now that I've given some background on the basic history of the Crimean Tatars and the Soviet justification, which I think is complete baloney, for the reason of deportation, and what I think the real reasons are. Let's go into what happened 74 years ago in Crimea. The Soviet military comes back into Crimea about 11th of May, and they issue a decree demanding ordering the deportation of the entire Crimean Tatar population into Uzbekistan on the basis that they are supposedly all traitors to the Soviet motherland and had collaborated with Nazi Germany. On 18th to 20th of May, the Soviet NKVD, about 23,000 armed internal troops and 9,000 NKVD operative agents, round up over 180,000 Crimean Tatars, take them on Willy Jeeps provided by the United States by Lend-Lease. In this case, Lend-Lease was being provided. And they are taken to train stations in Crimea, loaded onto these trains, and deported eastward on their way to Uzbekistan. They are given very little in the way of food on these trains. The official ration, less than 650 grams of food per person per day, not very much, but it is more than they will receive once they get into the special settlement and internal exile in Uzbekistan and the Urals. So most of the Crimean Tatars that are deported, out of the 180,000, 150,000 are sent to Uzbekistan. And then the diverted after the deportation is underway, a little over 30,000 into the Urals. And then there is a third group of Crimean Tatars, about 11,000 men, that are mobilized for forced labor. 6,000 are sent to forced labor construction brigades that are technically in the Red Army. Most of them going into Kazakhstan. Another 5,000 are mobilized into the labor army, which I talked about with regard to the Germans. Right, but essentially, they are sent into conditions very similar to that of Gulag prisoners under NKVD surveillance and supervision. These particular men are mobilized for forced labor in coal mining industry in the Moscow and Tula Oblast, the Moscow coal basin in that region. And also a number of Germans that are mobilized for coal mining in those same regions in the labor army. But the brigades are kept separately. But a lot of the decrees will refer to both German and Crimean Tatars with regard to the mining of coal by the labor army in the Moscow and Tula Oblast. So we have like 3 geographical areas of dispersal. And the largest, Uzbekistan, we'll talk about first. Now, the largest number, over a third, over 56,000 Crimean Tatars are sent to the Tashkent Oblast, the areas outside of the capital city of the Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic. Okay. Now, the journey there is pretty harrowing. Like I said, the rations are low, and there are deaths already en route. Estimates nearly 8,000 people, or about 5% of the total population, 1 out of every 20, dying before they even get to their destination in eastern regions of the Soviet Union. Okay. So, in addition to Tashkent Oblast, the second largest area of resettlement for Crimean Tatars is Samarkand Oblast. Again, the areas outside of the actual city of Samarkand, which was Tamerlane's capital, but still an important city in Uzbekistan during Soviet times and today, one with a large Tajik population, and that is over 30,000 people. So they are basically dumped out in the middle of Uzbekistan, particularly these areas around Tashkent and Samarkand, and they are initially mostly assigned to agricultural labor on kolkhozes, collective farms, or sovkhozes, state farms, including cultivation of cotton. And they are not rapidly integrated into the kolkhoz system. It takes quite a while for them to be given the most important aspect of being a member of the kolkhoz, particularly during the Second World War, because it's absolutely necessary for survival, and that is the small kitchen plot, the small land that they could privately cultivate vegetables and potatoes, even raise chickens for eggs on. And because of this, there are severe shortage of food. The actual rations being provided to them by the Soviet government during this time of initial exile is even lower than what they received on the trains. It is less than 600 grams of food per day per person. So malnutrition is a serious problem coming into Uzbekistan, as is inadequate housing. There are shortages there. But most importantly, perhaps, when combined with malnutrition, is lack of medical care. There is a serious malaria problem in Uzbekistan because the Soviets have not yet drained all the stagnant water where the mosquito larvae breed. And malaria can be easily fatal under two conditions. And one is you don't have any natural resistance to it. And this is the case of the Crimean Tatars, where the water is flowing through a lot of mountainous regions. Rivers are not stagnant. They move. No mosquitoes can breed in them. So malaria is not something that exists in Crimea, but it exists in Uzbekistan at this time. Later on, the Soviets will actually successfully eliminate malaria, but not until after it has killed a very large number of Crimean Tatar exiles. The other thing that can make malaria fatal, of course, is malnutrition. If you do not have proper nourishment, it can make it extremely deadly. Now, malaria, and I speak from personal experience. So I've had malaria a couple of times when I lived in Ghana, and the reason I'm still alive, one, I wasn't malnourished, but two, I was able to build up a resistance because before even arriving in Ghana, they put me on a prophylactic, and this is a standard for people coming to West Africa from outside the region. They put you on a prophylactic, and it doesn't always prevent you from getting malaria. It depends how long you stayed there. I had malaria for the first time. It was diagnosed after I had been in Ghana about a year, and I didn't even know I had it. It came up on a test for a medical exam for renewal of my contract. But the reason I was able to survive it, right, is because I was on the prophylactic, and it reduced the severity of it. Now, once they diagnosed it, they now have a cure. It takes 3 days, these pills that you take, and then you're cured from the malaria until you get infected by a mosquito carrying the fluke again. But in the case of Crimean Tatars, the Soviets initially did not have any prophylactics or treatments. The treatments then weren't as good, but they did exist for malaria. So they weren't given either preventive measures or once they contracted malaria, the cure for malaria that existed at the time. And on top of being malnourished, contracting malaria when they didn't have any natural resistance. And I built up natural resistance after having malaria 4 times. I was able to live in Ghana for more than 2 more years without contracting malaria at all. Right? And I was bitten by mosquitoes at night, which is only when the ones that carry the fluke come out many times. So I'm sure that my body was infected, but it was able to ward it off because I had built up a resistance. The Crimean Tatars, of course, had no resistance upon being dumped there, and the normal immune system resistance to any disease that they had was severely eroded by malnutrition. So they are sent there, and large numbers have died. Official numbers for the first year and a half in exile in Uzbekistan, almost 27,000 Crimean Tatars dying. And of course, almost all of these are premature. A few old people that might have died anyways. But for the most part, Malaria is particularly dangerous for children under age 5 because they don't have fully developed immune systems. People that would have lived considerably longer. And so this is 17.8% of the total population of the Crimean Tatar exiles in Uzbekistan in a year and a half. Now the actual numbers may be very much higher. This is just what the Soviet NKVD has recorded and is survived in the archives that we can look at. And Crimean Tatar activists have in the past made claims that the numbers of actual real deaths was much, much higher. I don't want to get in a debate. I think the numbers that we have, we can say the bottom baseline of the Soviet NKVD figures is high enough. We're talking in a year and a half, almost a fifth of the population dying as a result of being forcibly deported into areas with insufficient living conditions for the deported Crimean Tatars. They were used again mainly initially for agriculture, but because they didn't have the kitchen plots in the kolkhozes, a large number of the majority of them drift into industrial work in factories, and a large number of them in mine extractive work, because these are jobs that the Uzbeks did not want to take because they were quite onerous in terms of work conditions. So by 1948, only 30% of the Crimean Tatar deportees are still employed in agriculture that are working. The other 70% are in factories and extractive industries, mostly mining. They are placed under the legal restrictions of the special settlement regime. That is, they can't move without special permission from NKVD and then later MVD. They can only go for short periods of time, 3 days. They have to have kind of an internal visa assigned both ends as they leave their assigned special settlement and where they're going, and then when they return. So their freedom of movement, freedom to choose their place of residency is extremely restricted. And of course, this is declared to be permanent for the entire population for all eternity, Navechna, on 26th of November 1948. Crimean Tatars, like the Russian Germans, are one of the nationalities specifically denoted in this decree for eternal punishment. And this is the situation they find themselves in during the 1940s and 1950s. By 1948, things are starting to equal out as far as mortality rates and birth rates. And so in 1949, for the first time since 1944, more Crimean Tatars are finally born than die. But you have a shrinkage of the population in the years in between due to both massively increased mortality rates and also decreased fertility rates as a result of malnutrition, as a result of malaria, as a result of inhumane labor, which was also imposed upon women in the special settlements. All right, so this is the bulk of the Crimean Tatar population. In the other areas, some 30,000 sent to the Urals, the wet forest, where they are primarily employed in chopping down trees. Material conditions are even worse. In some places, they're only receiving 150 grams of bread every couple of days, sometimes only every 3 days. It's much colder, so hypothermia is a problem. There is the problem, of course, of disease. Malaria, obviously, too cold for malaria, is not the main problem in the Urals the way it is in Uzbekistan. But typhus, dysentery, various skin diseases, eczema, scabies, are major problems due to being housed in very unhygienic and overcrowded conditions. So there are some 30,000 Crimean Tatars in the Urals during the mid-1940s. The largest areas being Molotov Oblast, a little over 10,000, and then the next highest with over 8,500 people that are Crimean Tatar nationality of Mari Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic. And the third group, the forced laborers. I don't have a lot of information on the 6,000 sent to forced labor brigades in the Red Army, but I have a little bit on the 5,000 sent to the Labor Army in Moscow and Tula. And these are, again, coal mining is extremely hard work, extremely dangerous. Accidents happen all the time in coal mines, even today. But the Soviet government certainly had no care, no desire to do anything to provide minimal safety standards for labor army conscripts of German and Crimean Tatars, people who were punished people, enemy peoples, internal enemies of the Soviet government by its own definition. Obviously, there wasn't any armed resistance before the deportation and mobilization into forced labor by these people to the Stalin regime. And many had fought in the Red Army against the Nazi invasion and occupation of the western regions of the USSR. And so these are the three main groups. And so mainly here we're talking about 150,000 out of the 190,000 plus going to Uzbekistan, so over 3/4 in Uzbekistan. Now I talk about the legal conditions, I talk about the material conditions. One other thing, the Soviet government issued a decree in July 1944 that Crimean Tatars, along with other deportees, Chechens, Ingush, Karachais, Balkars, in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan were to receive their education. This is primary school education for the most part in the Russian language because there were not sufficient teachers in their indigenous language. This, of course, is not true. There were plenty of Crimean Tatars that were educated that could have taught in the Crimean Tatar language, but there was an attempt to try and destroy as much as possible the culture and the ties of these people to their homeland and their past and their separate, distinct identity in terms of its cultural expression. So the schooling and other institutions are in their native languages abolished. This happened, of course, to other deported peoples earlier, Koreans and the Germans, but this is significant. And then finally, the last thing I want to talk about before we get into the end of the special settlement restrictions, these apartheid-like laws on control of movement that are imposed upon the Crimean Tatars and other deported peoples, is that the Soviet government settled a large number of Russians and some Ukrainians, but more Russians, into the former houses and land of the Crimean Tatars, and it renames all of the place names in Crimea, not only Crimean Tatar place names, which would be the largest number of them, obviously the largest minority at 200,000 people. I mean minority strictly in a demographic sense. Obviously, politically, the indigenous people of Crimea, they have a distinct status separate from the German minority, which is some 50,000, or the Greek minority, which is deported out of Crimea to special settlements in areas of Russian Federation, the Urals, and Kazakhstan in July 1944. But the erasure of the indigenous place names occurs in Crimea as an attempt to prevent them from being able to return, to kind of give a Soviet claim that Crimea is Russian territory rather than Crimean Tatar territory. So Crimean Tatars are dispersed in Uzbekistan, particularly areas outside of Tashkent, in the Tashkent Oblast, in various industrial settlements and mining sites, as well as some still remaining in collective and state farms. Some of the state farm conditions are very bad. At Narpe, Sovkhots, the Soviet government has to transfer over 2,600 Crimean Tatars to Tajikistan, where they are put on cotton cohorts as well, in order to prevent them from all dying. Gastrointestinal disease, dysentery, malaria, these are all serious problems because of the lack of medical care and because of lack of proper food and nourishment for the Crimean Tatars. And again, it's really only in 1949 that they are on the path to overcoming this problem when we start to see live births among Crimean Tatar special settlers overtake annual death rates. The final thing here is that they are released from the special settlement on April of 1956. So they spend 12 years under the special settlement restriction. Exact date here. The 28th of April, 1956. Crimean Tatars, Balkars, and Meskhetian Turks are all released from special settlement restriction. Now this means they can now move around within areas that they've been deported to. So the Crimean Tatars can now move around within Uzbekistan, including going to the actual cities such as Tashkent and Samarkand, try and get better jobs, try and get higher education, but of course not available in Crimean Tatar language, only in Uzbek and Russian, and to try and continue the process which they start shortly after the deportation, but it's difficult because of the restriction, to reunify those families that are broken up. Now, most of them managed to reunify earlier, even despite the special settlement restriction. They illegally move from place to place, but they can now do it legally within Uzbekistan and other areas, eastern part of the Soviet Union. But the decree that releases them from the special settlement restrictions, like the one that released the Germans, explicitly prohibits the Crimean Tatars from returning to Crimea, and it explicitly prohibits them from seeking redress for property loss in Crimea, which is a huge amount. Collectively, not only the lands, not only livestock, apiaries, that is beehives, vineyards, orchards, but also libraries, mosques, graveyards. All of these things are lost to the Crimean Tatars because they have to remain in Crimea, and they cannot obviously can't transfer something like a graveyard or your ancestral land from one area of Eurasia clear across to the other area of Eurasia. Right, so they are stuck still being in exile from their homeland, and still there is a number of de facto discriminations against them following their official release from the special settlement restriction. And there is a long period of time, I won't get into this video, but I probably will do one in the future on it, where they actively agitate, actively demonstrate and protest and organize for the restoration of their national and civil rights. Well, right now I wanted to concentrate on the actual deportation and the years in the special settlement restrictions under Stalin mostly, although you will note that 28th of April 1956 is considerably after 5th of March 1953. So there's a period of time, even after Stalin is dead, the Crimean Tatars are still laboring under the legal disabilities of the special settlement restriction. All right, so this is a day of mourning, a day of remembrance, a day of commemoration for these victims, for this crime against humanity, for the Crimean Tatar people and all of their friends. And if you are a associate of mine, a friend of mine who is part of the Crimean Tatar diaspora or just a supporter of their cause, feel free to circulate this video to anybody you think would be interested. And have a good weekend.